There is a cliff face in the Kimberley region of Western Australia that has not been touched by any human hand in thousands of years. It faces north. The morning light reaches it at an angle that makes the painted figures on its surface seem to glow from within. And the figures are extraordinary, tall, graceful, dressed in ornamentation that no archaeologist has ever found physical evidence of, carrying objects that no one has ever successfully identified, moving with a fluid, elegant confidence that suggests the artist who painted them had seen these beings move, had studied their movement, had known them in some way that we can only guess at now. Who are they? That is the question that drives everything we will discuss tonight. It is a question that some of the most experienced rock art researchers in the world have spent their careers trying to answer. It is a question that Indigenous elders who have lived their entire lives within sight of these images have answered in their own terms, in their own traditions, in ways that Western science has not always known how to receive. It is a question that keeps producing new dimensions the more carefully it is examined. Northern Australia contains what is arguably the most extraordinary concentration of ancient rock art anywhere on the planet. The Kimberley region of Western Australia, the Arnhem Land Plateau of the Northern Territory, the Cape York Peninsula of Queensland, Murujuga, also called the Burrup Peninsula, on the Pilbara coast. These places hold images that go back not centuries, but tens of thousands of years, possibly to the earliest period of fully modern human cognition, to the moment when Homo sapiens became, in some crucial sense, us. And within those vast archives of ancient imagery, there are figures that do not fit. Figures that do not match any known category of human or animal representation. Figures wearing what appear to be structured headgear of a kind that has no parallel in any identified Australian cultural tradition. Figures with proportions and postures and ornamentation that are, by any honest assessment, strange. Figures that the people who have lived beside them for generations have always described not as humans and not as animals, but as something else, something older, something other, something that was here and is not here now, or was here and is still here in a way that the ordinary methods of investigation cannot quite reach. Tonight we are going to spend a long time with these images. We are going to look at 20 of the most remarkable, most debated, and most genuinely mysterious categories of figure in the Northern Australian rock art tradition. We are going to look at what the images actually show. We are going to look at what researchers have said about them and where those explanations fall short. We are going to look at what the traditional owners of these images have said about them, because they have been in conversation with these figures for longer than any other people alive. And we are going to sit with the uncertainty, because the honest answer to the question of who these beings are is that we do not fully know, and the not knowing, properly understood, is not a failure, it is an invitation. If you are settling in for the night, get comfortable. This is a long story, and it deserves to be told without rushing. The figures on the walls of Northern Australia have been waiting for tens of thousands of years to be seen clearly. A few more hours of careful attention is nothing. Let us begin. Number 1. The Guon Guon, the figures that should not exist here. If you search for the Bradshaw paintings online, you will find them immediately. They are extraordinarily striking. In a landscape that also contains the bold, direct, symbol-like imagery of many Aboriginal Australian traditions, the Guon Guon figures are something else entirely. They are elegant, they are detailed, they are in motion. The figures are typically painted in a deep red, sometimes shading toward mulberry or maroon, against the pale orange and cream of Kimberley sandstone. They are elongated, their limbs are slender and long. Their postures suggest dance or ceremony or some kind of purposeful movement, and they are decorated. This is perhaps the most striking thing about them, and the thing that generates the most debate. The decorations are complex. Headdresses that rise from the tops of their heads in elaborately structured plumes or frames, tassels hanging from their arms and waists, sashes or bands crossing their torsos, objects in their hands that have been described, depending on who is looking at them, as bags, as ceremonial implements, as weapons, as instruments, as things with no clear analog in any known archaeological context. They look, if you are allowed an honest first impression, like they are dressed. And this is the problem that has exercised researchers since a British pastoralist named Joseph Bradshaw reported them in 1891. The problem is that the Guon Guon figures appear to represent a level of material complexity in terms of clothing, ornamentation, and accessories that does not match the material record of any known Australian cultural tradition at any period. This does not mean the images are not Aboriginal. The evidence strongly suggests they are Aboriginal, created by the ancestors of the Aboriginal peoples who have lived in the Kimberley for at least 65,000 years. But they represent something about the past of those ancestors that has not survived into the material record, and that the rock art tradition itself seems to eventually move away from, and that nobody has been able to fully explain. The age of the Guon Guon is contested. Some of the images have been dated using indirect methods. The most widely cited dating approach used radiocarbon analysis of wasp nests that had been built over the paintings, providing a minimum age for the images beneath. Some of these dates came back at around 17,000 years old. Other researchers have argued for older dates, some as old as 50,000 years. The technical debate continues. What is not debated is that the Guon Guon are old. Very old. Old enough that the people who painted them lived in a world that was, in fundamental ways, different from any world we have direct access to. The climate of northwestern Australia 17,000 years ago was significantly different from today. The coastline was further out. Species that are now extinct were then alive. The environmental and social context of the Guon Guon painters is not something we can reconstruct with any confidence. But some Aboriginal people in the Kimberley have knowledge of these images that is not archaeological. The Namaroto people and other Kimberley groups have traditions about the Guon Guon. In these traditions, the Guon Guon were painted not by human hands, but by the Guon Guon themselves, small bird-like spirit beings who use their own blood to mark the rock. The figures are thus, in this tradition, self-portraits of spirit beings, not human representations at all. This is not a story designed to deflect academic inquiry. It is a serious, traditional account that encodes a specific understanding of the ontological status of these images. They are not images of things. They are things. They are presences. To ask who they show is, in this framework, a category error, like asking who took a photograph of a person rather than simply saying, "This is the person." The debate about the Guon Guon touches every fault line in the study of ancient rock art. The question of whether academic interpretive frameworks are adequate for understanding images created within a completely different cosmological system. The question of who has the authority to interpret images on the land of peoples whose connection to those images is thousands of years older than the discipline of archaeology itself. The question of whether the decorations depicted represent literal objects that the figures wore, or symbolic representations of spiritual attributes, or something else entirely that our categories of literal and symbolic are not equipped to distinguish. The figures are still there, on hundreds of sites across the Kimberley. They do not resolve the debate by being looked at more carefully. If anything, the more carefully they are looked at, the more questions they generate. They are among the most beautiful things painted by human hands on this planet, and we do not know who or what they show. Number 2. The Wanjina, cloud beings with no mouths. The Wanjina look at you. They always look at you. Their eyes are enormous, round, black, filling much of the upper portion of their faces. Their faces are white, ringed by radiating lines, feathers, or structures that suggest a halo or a cloud formation. And where a mouth should be, there is nothing. The Wanjina have no mouths. They are among the most immediately recognizable images in Australian rock art. They are also, by some measures, among the most recent of the major rock art traditions in the Kimberley, with some examples dating to a few hundred years ago, and the tradition of repainting that has kept many figures fresh and vivid throughout their history. But they overlay and sometimes coexist with the much older Guon Guon tradition, and their origin, in terms of what inspired their distinctive form, is a subject of genuine inquiry. The Aboriginal people of the Kimberley, particularly the Warrara, Namaroto, and Wanjina groups, are the custodians of the Wanjina tradition. Their knowledge of the Wanjina is not archaeological, it is living. The Wanjina are creator beings who emerged from the sea and the sky in the dreaming, the ontological dimension of Aboriginal Australian cosmology that is not past but present, not myth but reality, not metaphor but truth of a kind that requires different categories to properly understand. The Wanjina created the landscape. They brought rain. They were responsible for the fertility of the land and the increase of the species that lived on it. When they died, or when they transitioned from active presence to latent presence, their images appeared on the rock, or they painted themselves on the rock, or the rock took on their form. The precise account varies by group and by the level at which the knowledge can be shared with outsiders. The absence of a mouth is not an accident of artistic convention. It is theologically significant. In the Warrior tradition, the Wanjina do not need mouths because they communicate not through speech but through thought, through the direct imposition of will on the world around them. Some accounts suggest that if the Wanjina had mouths, the rain they commanded would never stop. The absence of the mouth is a kind of seal, a containment. What researchers from outside the tradition have struggled with is the question of why the Wanjina look the way they do. The radiating halo, the enormous eyes, the frontal, confrontational gaze that is actually unusual in Australian rock art, where profile and active positions are more common. The structural quality of the headdress or crown. Several researchers have noted that the Wanjina bear a passing resemblance to images produced by other ancient cultures on the other side of the world. The large eyes, the radiating headdress, the frontal gaze. These features appear in Sumerian cylinder seal imagery, in certain Egyptian representations, in various ancient Near Eastern traditions. The resemblance is almost certainly coincidental, a product of the limited number of ways the human face can be stylized into a powerful symbolic form. But the resemblance has attracted a significant amount of alternative theory. The alternative theories are not persuasive. The Wanjina are not ancient astronauts. They are not Egyptian visitors. They are not Sumerian missionaries who crossed 2 oceans in the Bronze Age. These claims require ignoring everything we know about pre-modern maritime technology, while accepting, without evidence, hypothetical voyages that would be remarkable achievements even for modern vessels. But there is a serious version of the question that does not require ancient astronauts, which is, what did the original Wanjina painters see, or conceptually understand, that they chose to encode in this specific visual form? What is the relationship between the visual conventions of the Wanjina and the specific spiritual and cosmological content that those conventions were developed to express? That question is not answered by dismissing alternative theories. It is answered, imperfectly and partially, by engaging seriously with what the custodians of this tradition have to say about it. The Wanjina are still painted. They are still cared for. They are still active presences in the spiritual geography of the Kimberley. They are not museum pieces. They are not historical artifacts. They are living religious figures in a living religious tradition, and the rock faces that hold them are not galleries, but sacred sites in the fullest sense of that word. When you look at the photographs, and the photographs are remarkable, look at the eyes. The eyes follow you. That is not a trick of perspective. It is a deliberate technique, a formal choice made by painters who understood exactly what they wanted the image to do and knew how to make it do that. They wanted the Wanjina to see you. Number 3. The Lightning Brothers, a story written in stone for thousands of years. In the Victoria River district of the Northern Territory, there is a rock shelter called Delamere Air Weapons Range Site, and on its walls there are 2 enormous figures that have been painted, repainted, and maintained continuously for at least 5,000 years. They are called the Lightning Brothers. Their names, in the Wardaman language, are Yagjagbula and Jabaringi. They are brothers. They are powerful, and they are the subject of one of the most extraordinary examples of continuous ceremonial engagement with rock art anywhere in the world. The Lightning Brothers are tall, really tall. The figures at the main site are painted at a scale that is designed to be seen from a distance, which suggests a ceremonial staging of some kind, an encounter with images that were meant to impress not only by what they showed, but by how large they showed it. Their bodies are painted with parallel lines, a convention in Arnhem Land and surrounding areas that often represents body painting or scarification patterns associated with ceremony and initiation. What makes the Lightning Brothers remarkable among researchers is the documented continuity of their maintenance. The Aboriginal custodians of this site have been coming back to repaint the figures, refreshing them against the weathering of seasons for at least as long as oral tradition can trace. The repainting is not simply a cosmetic restoration, it is a ceremonial act. The figures are not maintained because they are old, they are maintained because they are active, they are present, they require the ongoing relationship. Wardaman elder Bill Idumduma Harney, who has spoken publicly about his traditions to a degree that he considers appropriate for outside audiences, has described the Lightning Brothers as real beings, not metaphors. They walked the land. They shaped the landscape through their actions, their quarrels, their ceremonies. The specific landforms in the Victoria River region, particular rock formations, water sources, significant topographic features, are understood in Wardaman tradition as the physical traces of the Lightning Brothers' presence. The story encoded in the image is a complete cosmological narrative. The two brothers had a dispute, as all good mythological brothers do, over a woman or over ceremonial objects, depending on which version of the story is being told and to whom. The dispute produced lightning, because that is what happens when beings of that power argue, and the aftermath of the dispute is visible in the landscape today, in the form of the rock shelter and its images. This is not a simple story used to explain a natural phenomenon in the absence of meteorological knowledge. The Wardaman understanding of lightning is precise. They know what causes it in the physical sense. The story of the Lightning Brothers operates in a different register of explanation, one that is concerned not with mechanism but with meaning, not with the physics of electrostatic discharge, but with the moral and cosmological significance of power, conflict, and consequence. The figures on the wall encode this, the parallel lines on the body, the specific postures that a trained eye can read as indicators of the brothers' respective characters and their relationship to each other, and to the ceremony being depicted. The relative sizes and the specific positions of the two figures, which encode information about their relationship in the way that the arrangement of characters in a painting in the European tradition encodes narrative information. For a non-Wardaman observer, looking at the Lightning Brothers is like reading a page of text in a language you have never learned. You can see that it is text. You can appreciate its elegance and its care, but you cannot read it. What we know from outside the tradition is that the paintings have been here for a very long time, that they have been continuously maintained, which is almost without parallel in the global rock art record, that the beings they depict are understood by the people whose tradition this is as actual persons, as agents with ongoing significance, as beings whose story is still active in the landscape they shaped, and that the storm that brews in the build-up season, the lightning that flashes across the Victoria River country between October and March, is not a separate phenomenon from the figures on the wall. It is the same phenomenon, understood at different depths. Number 4. The X-ray figures, bodies opened to their bones. There is a style of rock art in Western Arnhem Land that is unlike anything else in the ancient world. The figures are painted with their internal anatomy visible, not as a cross-section or a cutaway diagram in the modern medical sense, but as a simultaneous interior and exterior view, the body and its contents shown together, the organs and bones and internal structures made visible alongside the skin and the surface. Spine, ribs, the organs of digestion, the backbone. In fish, the bone structure of the spine and the lateral skeleton. In kangaroos and wallabies, the internal organs, including the stomach and the intestines. In humans, the skeletal structure, and sometimes the heart. Researchers call this the X-ray style. The name was coined by early Western observers who reached for the most familiar technology that seemed to do something similar, which was radiographic imaging. X-ray art. It is a useful descriptive label, but it carries a danger. The danger is that calling it X-ray art suggests that the purpose of the style is diagnostic, that it was made to show the inside of things in the way that an X-ray image shows the inside of a body. The Beninj/Mungi people, who are the traditional owners of the Arnhem Land region where the most extensive X-ray art is found, do not describe the style as diagnostic. They describe it as complete. A figure shown only on the outside is, in this understanding, an incomplete representation. The inside is part of the being. The bones and organs are as real and as present as the skin. Showing the inside alongside the outside is not a technical trick or a metaphor. It is a comprehensive way of representing a thing as it actually is. The Arnhem Land X-ray tradition goes back a very long time. Dates for the oldest examples range from roughly 1,000 years ago to much older, depending on the method used and the specific site. But what is certain is that the tradition has been continuously practiced, continuously developed, and continuously maintained within living communities throughout its history. The X-ray figures are, in many cases, genuinely beautiful. The barramundi fish, a culturally significant species in Arnhem Land that is important as food and as a ceremonial subject, is rendered in X-ray style with a formal sophistication that modern artists have explicitly admired and been influenced by. The painting of the fish shows the bones of the spine, the swim bladder, the arrangement of the internal organs, and the external form simultaneously, in a composition that is graphically elegant and informationally rich. But some of the X-ray figures are not so easily categorized. There are humanoid figures in the X-ray tradition that show internal structures which do not correspond to any known human anatomy, or even to the standard skeletal representation that is the most common interior element in X-ray human figures. Some figures show internal structures that appear to be geometric, systematic, or mechanical in a way that anatomical organs are not. These figures are a small subset of the overall X-ray tradition, but they are the ones that generate the most interpretive uncertainty. Are these representations of spiritual anatomy? The understanding in many Aboriginal Australian traditions that beings have both a physical body and a spiritual body, that the internal structure of a spirit being may differ from that of a physical being, is well documented. The interior structures shown in some unusual X-ray figures may be representations of the interior of spirit beings, which would naturally differ from the interior of physical humans or animals. Are they representations of sickness? Some researchers have proposed that figures with unusual internal structures are sick figures, representations of disease states in which the body's internal order has been disrupted. Disease in many Aboriginal Australian medical traditions is understood in terms of objects or forces entering the body from outside or being introduced by sorcery, and the visual representation of a diseased body might look different from a healthy one. Are they symbolic? The internal markings might not be meant as anatomical representations at all, but as symbolic information about the identity, power, or spiritual status of the being shown. The visual language of internal markings could be operating more like heraldry than like medicine. The researchers who have worked most closely with Arnhem Land communities on the interpretation of rock art are cautious about proposing definitive answers. The tradition is alive. The knowledge is held. The answers are available in principle to those who can ask the right questions in the right relationships with the right people. But the knowledge is layered, with different levels accessible to different people at different stages of their lives, and the images at the deepest layers of meaning are not images that outside researchers are typically in a position to receive. What we can say is this: the X-ray tradition represents one of the most philosophically interesting approaches to visual representation in the history of art. It asks a question that most artistic traditions have answered by convention: what should we show? And it answers that question with an insistence on completeness that modern art theory, circling around questions of perception and reality and representation, has only partially been able to theorize. Show everything that is real. Show it all at once. The result is an image that is simultaneously a physical description, a spiritual assertion, and a philosophical statement. And some of those images show things we cannot explain. Number 5. The Quinkins of Cape York, ancient guardians at the edge of the world. On the eastern side of Cape York Peninsula in far northern Queensland, there is a sandstone plateau where the rock shelters go deep and the walls are covered with images that have been accumulating for tens of thousands of years. The country is called Quinkin country, after the spirit beings who are among its most distinctive residents. The Quinkins are tall. They live in the cracks of the rocks, in the deep fissures of the sandstone, in the places where the rock opens to darkness. They come out at particular times, drawn by human activity or by conditions in the landscape, and their interactions with people are not always benign. There are two main types of Quinkin. The Tamara are roughly human in proportion, sometimes shown with elongated limbs, sometimes with features that read as friendly or at least neutral. The Imjim, also called the striped Quinkin, are different. They are angular, They are tall and thin and have knees that point backward, a specific anatomical irregularity that appears in other spirit being traditions across northern Australia and that is consistently associated with beings that are not what they appear to be, beings that can move in ways that people cannot. The backward knee is a detail that rewards attention. In multiple geographically separated Indigenous traditions across northern Australia, beings with backward-pointing knees are marked out as dangerous, as supernatural, as liminal figures existing between the categories of human and not human. The detail is precise enough that it is unlikely to have developed independently in multiple traditions without some shared origin in experience or observation. Experience of what? That question is the one that the backward knee detail keeps opening. The Quinkins rock art at the sites near the township of Laura includes some of the most complex and layered panels in Australian rock art. The images have been painted over a very long period, with different styles and different subjects from different eras overlapping and interacting on the same surfaces. There are macropods, large kangaroos and wallabies, painted with natural precision. There are fish and turtles. There are human figures in various postures. And then there are the Quinkins, whose presence among these more naturalistic images marks them as a different category of thing. At a site called Split Rock, accessible to public visitors as part of a protected area, there is a Quinkin figure that is particularly striking. Its height, measured on the rock face, is roughly 3.5 meters. Its body is elongated, its limbs stick-thin, its head disproportionately large for its body. It is turned slightly as if caught in movement, and the energy of the image is such that many visitors describe a physical sensation looking at it, a feeling that the figure is present in some sense beyond the merely visual. This is not an unusual response. Rock art researchers studying visitor responses to powerful images at sites around the world have documented that certain images produce somatic responses in viewers, physical sensations that cannot be explained by the visual content alone. The images at Split Rock and at other Quinkin sites regularly produce these responses. Gugu Badhoon and other traditional owners of the Quinkin country describe the Quinkins as real beings, not as artistic inventions. They live in the rock. They're still there. The sites where the paintings are located are sites of their habitation, and the protocol when visiting these sites is informed by that understanding. You do not approach certain cracks in the rock. You do not make loud noise. You do not act in ways that would be disrespectful in the home of any being whose power you recognize. The Quinkin tradition is not isolated. Beings with similar characteristics, tall, thin, inhabiting rock crevices, appearing at liminal times, with backward knees or other anatomical irregularities, appear in traditions across a vast swath of tropical Australia. The similarity is not coincidence. It either reflects a shared tradition maintained across great distances, or a shared category of experience that multiple independent traditions develop similar responses to, or some combination of both. What is the category of experience? Australian researchers working within a phenomenological framework have suggested that the beings described in these traditions may be understood as experiences of the landscape itself, as personifications of the ways in which specific geological features, specific light conditions, specific sound environments produce altered states of perception or unusual psychological experiences. The deep sandstone crevices of Quinkin country are places where the light changes suddenly, where sounds reflect and amplify in unusual ways, where the transition between open air and enclosed darkness produces rapid perceptual shifts. The Quinkins, in this framework, are what those experiences look like when encoded in the visual language of sacred beings. This is a sophisticated and respectful interpretation that does not reduce the Quinkins to hallucination or invention, but it also does not fully explain the specific consistency of their described characteristics across thousands of kilometers of geographically and culturally varied territory. The backward knees, the extreme height, the habitation in rock crevices, the unpredictable relationship with humans. These details are too consistent, too specific, too geographically widespread to be explained entirely by local geological experience. There is something being described. What it is, exactly, remains open. Number 6. The tall beings of Arnhem Land, figures that touch the ceiling of caves. In Arnhem Land, in the Northern Territory of Australia, there are rock shelters whose walls bear figures that have been placed with extraordinary deliberateness. Not in the spaces where a standing person could comfortably reach, not at eye level, where you would put an image you wanted to look at easily. Some of the most significant figures in Arnhem Land rock art are placed high, very high, higher than any standing person could reach without some kind of scaffolding or another person's shoulders to stand on. Why? One interpretation is height as significance. The most powerful beings should be placed at the greatest height, requiring physical effort to approach and creating a visual relationship in which the viewer must look up to the figure, which creates a specific psychological register of awe and submission. This is not a uniquely Australian phenomenon. Many of the world's sacred images have been deliberately placed in positions that require effort to see, that make the viewer physically assume a posture of supplication. But some of the tall figures of Arnhem Land are notable not just for their placement, but for what they show. There are figures in Arnhem Land that are described in the research literature as tall beings, not because they are painted tall in the rock, which many figures are, but because the beings they depict are represented as extraordinarily tall in relation to the other figures around them. Scale is used deliberately in Australian rock art to communicate importance, with more significant beings shown larger than less significant ones, regardless of their actual physical size. But in some panels, the tall beings are shown as tall in relation to what appear to be ordinary humans in the same scene, suggesting that their scale is not simply a marker of spiritual importance, but an attempt to represent a genuine physical difference. At a site in the Keep River National Park in the Northern Territory, there are figures that researchers working in the area have described as among the most unusual they have encountered in decades of fieldwork. The figures are anthropomorphic, that is, they have the overall form of a human being, with head, torso, arms, and legs. But their proportions are unusual. The limbs are very long relative to the torso. The head is relatively small. They are shown in a posture that has been described as dignified, as formal, as having a quality of presence that distinguishes them from the humans shown elsewhere on the same panel. The Jeminjung people and other groups whose country includes the Keep River area have traditions about beings that are not human who have been seen in the landscape. The relationship between those traditions and the figures on the rock is not something that is publicly discussed in detail, because it is not something for public discussion. But the existence of a tradition about tall, non-human beings in landscapes where tall, non-human beings are painted on rock faces is a correlation that is at least worth noting. There is a broader pattern in Arnhem Land rock art, documented by researchers including George Tulupka, who spent decades recording the region's art, of a succession of figure types through time. The earliest figures are referred to as archaic figures, and are among the most unusual in the entire corpus. They are large. They are not clearly identifiable as any known species. They predate the X-ray tradition by a very long margin, and some of them are described by Beninj/Mungai elders not as artistic representations at all, but as presences that were there before the rock was painted, beings that the rock captured rather than beings that were painted onto it. This is a cosmological claim, not an archaeological one. But it is a claim that is grounded in a tradition of engagement with these images that stretches back further than any Western academic tradition, and it deserves to be received as such. The tall beings are on the rock. They have been on the rock for a very long time. The people who put them there, or recognized them in the rock, understood them as real. The tradition that carries that understanding is still alive, and the beings are still tall. Number 7. The Mimi, beings who can only be seen when they choose. The Mimi are central to the artistic and spiritual life of the Beninj/Mungai people of Western Arnhem Land, and their importance cannot be overstated. They are teachers. They are the original artists. They are the beings who taught humans to paint, to dance, to hunt, to cook. They taught humans how to be human, and the evidence of that teaching is on the walls of the rock shelters where the Mimi themselves live. The Mimi are extraordinarily thin. This is not stylistic exaggeration. The Mimi are thin because they are fragile. They are so fragile that if the wind blows too strongly, they must hide in the crevices of the rock, because the wind would break them. They are tall and slender, and they move in ways that the wind would make impossible for any being that could not seek shelter in the rock itself. This is one of the things that makes the Mimi remarkable in terms of their physical ontology as described in the tradition. They are beings of extreme physical delicacy who live inside rock. Not in caves, in the sense of enclosed spaces within the rock, but inside the rock, in the stone itself, in a way that the rock does not impede them. The crevices are doors. The stone opens for them. When the Mimi are painted in the rock art of Arnhem Land, they are painted in a style that is distinctive and immediately recognizable. Long, slender limbs, a body that is more line than mass, a sense of quick, precise movement, often caught in mid-action, dancing or hunting or performing some task, with a frozen energy that suggests they were moving and stopped, or rather that the moment of their movement was captured in the rock in the way that a photograph captures a moment in light. The Mimi style of painting is one of the oldest in the Arnhem Land sequence. George Chalupka's sequence places Mimi-style figures in the pre-Estuarine period, dating to at least 10,000 years ago and possibly considerably older. If this sequencing is correct, the Mimi have been a subject of Arnhem Land art for as long as Arnhem Land has had art, which is to say for as long as the region has been inhabited by modern humans. There is something philosophically complex happening in the relationship between the Mimi and the rock art tradition. The Mimi are said to have taught humans to paint. The oldest paintings in Arnhem Land are of the Mimi themselves. This creates a loop that resists the simple logic of the cause and effect sequence. Did humans learn to paint and then paint the Mimi who taught them? Did the Mimi paint themselves and humans subsequently learn from those self-portraits? Did the teaching and the painting happen simultaneously, in the dreaming time where linear sequence is not the organizing principle? Beninj/Mungai knowledge holders who have been willing to discuss this with researchers do not describe it as a paradox, because in the dreaming framework, the events of origin are not locked in a sequence of before and after, but are present simultaneously. All of them real, and all of them now. The Mimi taught humans to paint in the dreaming. The paintings from before humans learned to paint are the Mimi's own. The paintings from after humans learned are human, but they are made in the tradition that the Mimi established. The tradition is continuous, and the origin of the tradition is present in it everywhere. What makes the Mimi figures so striking when you see them in photographs, or, if you are fortunate, in person, is their life. They are alive in the image in a way that is different from many other rock art traditions. They seem genuinely caught in motion. They seem genuinely present. There is something in the way they are painted, the balance, the precision, the economy of line, that produces an experience of presence that researchers who have spent careers studying ancient imagery describe as unusual. The Mimi are perhaps the most beloved figures in the Arnhem Land tradition, the most associated with care and with teaching. Their fragility is part of their character. Beings powerful enough to teach humans how to be human, who can nevertheless be broken by wind. The combination of power and delicacy is philosophically rich and not easily explained away. They are still in the rock, the wind still blows, and they are still hiding. Number 8. The Ant People and the Deep Desert, Figures from a World Now Gone. In the desert regions of central and southern Australia, rock art traditions exist that receive less attention in the spectacular imagery of the Kimberley and Arnhem Land, but that are no less remarkable. The Anangu people of the Western Desert have a rich tradition of sacred art, much of which is not rock art but ground art, drawing in sand, designs on bodies, designs on sacred objects, a tradition that was equally sophisticated and equally old, but has left fewer durable traces. But where rock surfaces exist in the desert country, they were used. Some of the most puzzling of the desert figures have been described by researchers as the Ant People, a colloquial term that has entered the literature and is not a traditional name, but a description. These figures have a characteristic form, a rounded head, a thin neck, a compact body, and limbs that are drawn in a way that does not quite match normal human proportions. They are often shown in groups. They are often shown in what appears to be a structured arrangement, not random positioning, but placement that suggests organization, ranking, or ceremony. The term ant people comes from a loose similarity to the way ant bodies are sometimes drawn in children's illustration, with a large round head on a pinched neck on a compact body. This is an inadequate description, and something of a misleading one. The beings shown in these desert rock art figures are not described by any traditional owner as ant beings. The term is a researcher's shorthand that has been picked up and repeated. What they are, in terms of the traditions of the people whose country this is more complex. Many desert rock art sites are associated with specific Jukurpa narratives, the Anangu equivalent of the dreaming, and the figures on the rock are representations of beings who acted in those narratives. The specific identities of the beings are known to those with the appropriate level of ceremonial knowledge, and that knowledge is not publicly shared in full. What can be said from outside the tradition is that some of the desert figures show characteristics that are unusual, even within the broad range of unusual characteristics found in Australian rock art. At some sites in the South Australian desert, there are figures that appear to wear structured headgear of a kind that has no parallel in any documented Anangu material culture. The headgear is rendered in consistent ways across different sites, suggesting that whatever is being depicted was a real thing that the artist had actually seen, not an artistic convention invented for its own sake. It is round, it is structured. It sits on the head in a way that suggests it has weight and form. Attempts to identify the headgear as a natural feature, as an animal, as a hairstyle, as a ceremonial object, have not produced convincing results. It does not match any documented category. This does not mean it is not explainable. It means it has not yet been explained in a way that the evidence supports convincingly. The desert art is the least studied of the major Australian rock art traditions. The access challenges are enormous. The sites are remote. The protocols for approaching them are strict, and appropriately so. The research infrastructure is limited compared to the Kimberley or Arnhem Land. Much of the desert art that exists will never be fully documented before it is claimed by the ongoing process of erosion, salt crystallization, and the slow, patient work of the desert climate against the rock surfaces that hold it. What the desert holds in its rock art is not yet fully known. The categories of figure are not fully mapped. The traditions that give them meaning are held by communities that have survived extraordinary disruption and are managing the transmission of their knowledge in conditions of ongoing difficulty. The ant people, for want of a better name, are part of that unmapped territory. They are there, in the rock, in the red desert country, and the people who know what they are still there too. Number 9. Murujuga, the largest outdoor art gallery on Earth, and the oldest. On a peninsula called Murujuga, which is also known by the name the Burrup Peninsula, on the Pilbara coast of Western Australia, there is a concentration of rock art so vast that it has been called the largest outdoor art gallery on Earth. The numbers are genuinely staggering. Approximately 1 million individual rock art engravings have been documented on Murujuga. 1 million. On a peninsula roughly 40 kilometers long. The images were made not by painting, but by engraving, by pecking into the dark desert varnish that coats the ancient rock to reveal the lighter stone beneath. The Pilbara rock varnish forms over very long periods, and images made by removing it expose stone that then begins to revarnish. The degree of revarnishing on old images can give an indication of the relative age, though precise dating of rock engravings is technically difficult. But some of the Murujuga images are very old. The site has produced dating results that some researchers have interpreted as making these the oldest datable rock art images in the world, with ages in excess of 40,000 years, and possibly as much as 50,000 years, placing their origin at or near the time of the first human arrival in Australia. If even a fraction of the Murujuga images date to 50,000 years ago, they were made by people who are among the first Homo sapiens to have arrived in Australia. By people who represent the earliest, or among the earliest, instances of modern human symbolic art making anywhere on the planet. And what did these earliest artists paint? Animals, many of them. Thylacines, the Tasmanian tiger, shown on Murujuga in numbers that record its presence in mainland Australia long after its disappearance from the mainland in recent millennia. Macropods, turtles, fish, marine animals that indicate a knowledge of the coastal environment at a time when the coastline was much further from the current shore. And beings, humanoid figures. And among them, figures that are humanoid but unusual. Figures with round heads that have been described in the research literature as globular-headed figures. Figures with internal markings similar to, but distinct from, the X-ray tradition. Figures in postures and configurations that do not have obvious naturalistic explanations. The Narluma and Yaburara people are the traditional owners of Murujuga. Their knowledge of the site is ancestral and comprehensive in ways that archaeological survey cannot match. But the Yaburara people were devastated in the Flying Foam massacre of 1868, when settlers and police killed somewhere between 60 and 150 Yaburara people at a single site over 2 days. The massacre effectively destroyed the Yaburara community, and with it, the specific custodial knowledge of large portions of the Murujuga site. This is a loss that cannot be calculated. An archive of cultural knowledge developed over tens of thousands of years, disrupted in a single weekend of colonial violence, is not something that can be recovered. Parts of what was lost may be reconstructed, slowly and with difficulty, through comparative research and through the knowledge that survived in other Pilbara communities. But much of it is simply gone. The images at Murujuga are now under threat from something else: industrial pollution. A heavy industrial zone was established on the peninsula in the 20th century, including a fertilizer plant and various chemical industries. Acid rain from industrial emissions has been dissolving the desert varnish that protects the rock art, destroying images that survived 50,000 years of Pilbara weather. The globular-headed figures, the unusual beings, the animal forms of species long extinct in the region. They are dissolving. Not slowly in the geological sense, but quickly in the human sense. Some are already gone. Number 10. The Wanjina in other languages, cross-cultural resonances that demand explanation. Something strange happens when you show images of the Wanjina to people from other cultures. People from cultures with no knowledge of Australian art, shown photographs of Wanjina images for the first time, frequently have strong reactions. Not just aesthetic reactions, something closer to recognition. A sense hard to articulate that they have seen this before, or that this is familiar in a way that requires no explanation, even when the specific image is entirely new. This response has been documented informally by researchers who have shown Wanjina images to audiences around the world. It is not universal, but it is common enough to be noteworthy. What is being recognized? The most straightforward explanation is that the Wanjina encodes visual elements that are deeply embedded in human perception: large eyes, bilateral symmetry, frontal orientation, a round face, features that the human visual system is specifically tuned to respond to because we are a highly social species for whom recognizing faces is among the most important perceptual tasks. The Wanjina face is, in some sense, a maximized face. The eyes as large as they can be while still being plausibly face-like. The symmetry absolute. The frontal orientation complete. The face recognition system in the human brain responds to it as it responds to any face, only more so. This is a convincing explanation as far as it goes, but it does not explain the specific detail of the halo, the radiating structure around the face that is so consistent across thousands of years of Wanjina depiction. And here is where the cross-cultural resonances begin. The radiating halo around a sacred face is not unique to the Wanjina. It appears in Buddhist iconography, surrounding the faces and bodies of enlightened beings. It appears in Christian iconography, surrounding the heads of saints and the divine. It appears in ancient Egyptian art, surrounding the heads of gods. It appears in Mesopotamian cylinder seals, surrounding the heads of deities. Researchers who work within a diffusionist framework, the idea that cultural elements spread from one culture to another through contact, have proposed various routes by which the halo tradition could have moved from one part of the world to another. These proposals are not convincing when applied to Australia, where the degree of isolation from the rest of the world for most of its inhabited history makes contact-based diffusion implausible for most of the period in question. Carl Jung and later depth psychologists proposed a different explanation: that certain visual symbols arise independently in different cultures because they encode something about universal human psychological experience, that they are archetypal images arising from the collective unconscious. The halo as a representation of numinous presence, of the light that surrounds beings of transcendent power. In this framework, the Wanjina and the Buddha and the Christian saint all have halos, because all three traditions are encoding the same deep human experience of the sacred, and the visual form that experience takes is consistent because it is grounded in the structure of human perception and psychology. This is an interesting framework. It takes the cross-cultural resonance seriously without requiring contact between cultures. But it is not a complete explanation, because it reduces the Wanjina halo to a psychological artifact, rather than engaging with what the Worora and Garinyin and Wunumbal traditions say it represents. In those traditions, the structure around the Wanjina's face is not an aura or a symbolic nimbus. It is specific. It represents the Wanjina's relationship to rain and cloud and the atmospheric processes that bring life to this seasonally extreme landscape. The Wanjina are cloud beings. The structure around their faces is, on one level, a cloud, and on another level, the power that cloud represents, which is the power to bring rain or withhold it. So the halo is not a general sacred symbol. It is a specific sacred symbol, specific to the relationship between the Wanjina and the weather systems that define life in the Kimberley. And yet it looks like halos everywhere else. This is either a profound coincidence, an example of deep psychological convergence, evidence of a contact that the archaeological record does not support, or evidence that the traditions are encoding something real about the nature of certain kinds of being that multiple cultures have encountered. None of these options is comfortable. All of them are worth thinking about. Number 11. The helmeted figures and the question of what is on their heads. At multiple sites across northern Australia, separated by hundreds of kilometers of geographic and cultural variety, there are rock art figures wearing something on their heads. Not headdresses of the kind that appear in ceremonies and are documented in anthropological records. Not elaborate hair arrangements or crowns made from feathers and bark and fiber of the kind that are known from the historical record. Something else. Something that has a roundness, a structural density, a quality of enclosure that researchers have documented in site after site and have not been able to convincingly explain. The helmeted figures, as they are sometimes called in the research literature, appear in the Kimberley. They appear in Arnhem Land. They appear on Cape York. They appear on Murujuga. The consistency of the described characteristic across such geographically and culturally diverse sites is, by any measure, remarkable. What is on their heads? The most conservative explanation is that the figures are wearing elaborate ceremonial headgear of types that have not survived in the material record and are not documented in the ethnographic record, because the ethnographic record begins at a point already centuries or millennia after the figures were painted. Aboriginal Australian material culture, like all material culture, changed over time. Objects that were significant in one period were replaced by different objects in another. The absence of a specific type of headgear from the historical and ethnographic record does not mean it never existed. This is a reasonable and important point. We should not expect the material culture of people living 15,000 years ago to match the material culture of people living 500 years ago, any more than we would expect medieval European clothing to match Roman clothing, because they are from the same broad cultural tradition. But the specific quality of the helmet-like structures in these figures resists easy placement, even within a generous interpretation of ancient material culture variety. At a site in the Kimberley documented by researcher David Welch, a series of figures wearing rounded headgear were analyzed in detail. Welch noted that the headgear had specific features: a roundness, a separation from the body's neck that suggested a sealed or enclosed structure rather than a hat resting on the head, and in some cases markings on the surface of the headgear that appeared to be structural rather than decorative. He proposed that the headgear might represent gourd containers worn on the head, which is a practice known from some cultures. He proposed that it might represent a particular style of ceremonial headgear using materials like beeswax or resin that leave no archaeological trace. These are thoughtful proposals from a serious researcher. They are not wrong. They may be right, but they are not certain. And in the gap between thoughtful proposal and certainty, the question remains open. The Aboriginal traditional owners of sites with helmeted figures, when they've discussed them with researchers, have generally described the figures as beings rather than as costumed humans. Not humans wearing helmets, beings who look like this. The distinction is significant. It moves the interpretive question away from what kind of headgear would produce this appearance and toward what kind of being was understood to look like this. Several Kimberley elders have described the helmeted figures as related to sky beings, beings associated with the upper atmosphere or the stars, beings who are not of the earth in the way that humans are of the earth. The connection between the enclosed round headgear and a sky realm identity is consistent across multiple accounts, though the specifics vary. This does not constitute proof of anything in the scientific sense. Traditional knowledge accounts of rock art figures are not archaeological evidence in the technical meaning of that term, but they are evidence of a different kind. They are the record of thousands of years of engagement with these images by the people who have always lived alongside them. The accumulated wisdom of that engagement is not nothing. It is, arguably, the most detailed and the deepest database of information about these figures that exists. And that database consistently describes the helmeted figures as sky beings. Number 12. The figures with antennas, protrusions that have no easy explanation. Look at a specific category of figure in the Arnhem Land rock art tradition, a category that is less widely reproduced than the Wanjina or the Mimi, but that is, in some ways, more immediately striking in its strangeness. These figures are anthropomorphic. They have heads, torsos, arms, legs. They move in recognizable ways. They are painted with the economy and precision of artists who have practiced for years. And from their heads, from the tops of their heads or from the sides of their heads, there are protrusions. Not horns. Horns have a specific shape and a specific cultural context across many world traditions, and these are not that. Not antennae in the insect sense, because they are not painted as thin, flexible structures. They are solid. They are deliberate. They extend from the head in specific directions, sometimes vertically, sometimes at angles, sometimes in pairs, sometimes in groups of 3 or 4, and they are rendered with the same care and the same commitment to accurate representation that the rest of the figure receives. Researchers have proposed multiple explanations. The protrusions might be painted representations of specific ceremonial objects attached to the head, implements or tools held above the head in a specific gesture, or natural materials like branches or bones used in ritual contexts. These proposals are consistent with the fact that many rock art figures across Australia show people holding or wearing ceremonial objects, and there is no reason why head-mounted objects would be categorically different. The protrusions might be conventional markers of status or identity, visual codes within the rock art tradition that indicate something specific about the being represented, their role, their power, their relationship to other figures in the scene. Visual codes of this kind are well documented in rock art traditions around the world. The protrusions might be representations of feelers, in a metaphorical or cosmological sense. Beings that perceive the world through senses other than the 5 documented senses of human physiology might be represented as having additional physical structures associated with those additional senses. What makes this last proposal interesting, and what makes it more than simple speculation, is that it is consistent with how some traditional owners have described beings of this type when asked about them. The protrusions are associated with perception, with awareness, with the ability to sense things that ordinary humans cannot sense. The being with antenna-like protrusions is a being of enhanced or different perceptual ability. This is not a description of science fiction aliens. It is a description of a category of being that appears in many spiritual traditions, beings whose access to reality is greater than ordinary human access, whose perception extends beyond the normal range. Beings whose heads, in the tradition that represents them, show this enhanced perception through physical structures that signify it. Is this literal? Are the antenna-like protrusions meant to represent actual physical structures that the beings possessed? Or are they symbolic? Are they visual codes for a quality of perception rather than a physical structure? In the tradition that produced these images, the question of whether something is literal or symbolic may be a false dichotomy. If a being truly perceives things that humans cannot, then the visual representation of that capacity through a physical structure on the head is both literal, it represents a real difference between the being and ordinary humans, and symbolic. The physical structure encodes a quality rather than being the quality itself. Australian rock art scholars who have been most directly engaged with these questions, scholars like George Chalupka, David Welch, and more recently researchers working explicitly in collaboration with traditional owners, have tended toward careful restraint in their interpretations. They document what is there. They note the parallel across sites. They record what traditional owners have said about specific figures when those accounts are available. And they hold the interpretive question open, because the evidence available does not support a definitive answer, and the honest response to insufficient evidence is to say so. The figures are there. The protrusions are real. The explanation is incomplete. Number 13. The Namaroto, skeletons in the night sky. In Western Arnhem Land, there is a category of being that exists at the intersection of the terrifying and the sacred, that occupies the same kind of conceptual space that the most powerful of the world's night beings occupy, that speaks to the deepest human awareness of death and the form it takes. The Namaroto are skeletal. They are bones held together not by the ligaments and connective tissue of a living body, but by some other coherence, some animating principle that keeps the bones in the right arrangement and gives them movement. They fly. Not the graceful flight of birds, but something more direct, more purposeful, more associated with the whistling sound that the Namaroto make as they move through the night air. The Namaroto are dangerous. They kill people. They are associated with sickness that comes on suddenly and kills without apparent cause. They are associated with death in its most mysterious and unwelcome forms. When someone dies of something that cannot be explained, when a previously healthy person suddenly sickens and dies, the Namaroto may be responsible. In the rock art of Western Arnhem Land, the Namaroto appear as skeletal figures, rendered with the X-ray convention pushed to its extreme, so that there is no flesh at all, only the bones in their arrangement and the sinews or forces that hold them together. They are sometimes shown in flight. They are sometimes shown in relation to other figures in ways that suggest predator and prey. They are not figures that appear to be in ceremony. They are figures that appear to be hunting. The Namaroto tradition extends across a broad area of Arnhem Land and into adjacent regions. The consistency of the description, skeletal, flying, nocturnal, lethal, is remarkable across groups that have been largely independent of each other in other cultural respects. What is a skeleton? This sounds like a reductive question, but it is actually interesting. The human skeleton is invisible in life, hidden under the flesh. Most people in most traditional cultures, before the advent of anatomy as a scientific discipline, had limited direct knowledge of the full skeleton. They knew bones from butchering animals. They knew bones from death, when the flesh decays and leaves its framework. The skeleton as a complete, articulated structure was most likely understood through the context of death. A skeleton that moves, that flies, that hunts, is thus a representation of death itself as an active agent. Death that does not wait for the body to give out, but comes for the body. Death that has intention. This conceptual figure appears in other world traditions with different specific forms, but the same core logic. The Grim Reaper of European tradition. The skeletal Mictlantecuhtli of Aztec cosmology. The dancing skeletons of the Tibetan Buddhist tradition. Death as a mobile presence. But the Namaroto are not simply a universal archetype expressed in local terms. They have specific characteristics, specific behaviors, specific relationships to other beings in the Arnhem Land cosmological system that are not universal. The whistling sound, the specific relationship to sudden unexplained illness, the specific visual form in which they appear in the rock art. And they have been painted, in that specific form, for a very long time. What are we to make of beings that are so clearly specific, so clearly grounded in a detailed tradition, and so clearly concerned with a universal human experience, the experience of death, that crosses every cultural boundary? The Namaroto are an invitation to think about death seriously, as a being that has intention toward us, as something that seeks us in the night rather than simply happening to us. It is an invitation that most modern frameworks decline. The rock art does not decline it. The figures are there. They are flying. Number 14. Stenciled hands across 30,000 years. Before we look at more unusual figures, we should spend time with the most human of all the images on the rock walls of Northern Australia: the hands. In rock shelters across the continent, human hands have been pressed against the wall and surrounded by pigment, leaving a negative silhouette. A hand, perfectly preserved, pressed against rock, surrounded by the breath of someone who blew pigment in suspension around it. The technique is simple. The result is devastating. When you see a stenciled hand for the first time, the thing that strikes you is not its antiquity. It is its humanity. This is a hand. A human hand. The proportions are familiar. The shape of the palm, the spacing of the fingers, the slight curve of the digits, all of it is recognizable. This is a hand like your hand. The person who pressed it against that wall was a person like you, and they lived 30,000 years ago, or perhaps earlier. The oldest stenciled hands in Northern Australia have been dated, using uranium series methods applied to the calcium carbonate that has formed over them, to ages of more than 40,000 years. The specific ages are debated because the methods carry uncertainties and because different researchers have reached different conclusions from similar datasets. But the consensus is that hand stencils in Australia are among the oldest in the world, comparable in age to the famous stenciled hands at El Castillo in Spain, and that some Australian examples may be older. The person who pressed their hand against the rock at El Castillo in Spain, approximately 40,000 years ago, and the person who pressed their hand against a rock wall in northern Australia at roughly the same period were probably not connected. The distances and the oceans between them make contact unlikely. They were, however, the same kind of person. Modern humans. People with language, with symbolic thought, with a capacity for art and ceremony and the recording of a presence. They both pressed their hands against rock. Both said, "I was here." At sites across northern Australia, the hand stencils are sometimes surrounded by other imagery. Animals, geometric forms, and sometimes the hands themselves show something unexpected. Some of the stenciled hands show fewer than 5 fingers, missing digits, the deliberate folding of one or more fingers before the stencil was made, so that the resulting image shows 3 fingers, or 4, or a specific combination. The pattern of missing digits is not random. At some sites, the same combination appears repeatedly, suggesting that the omission is intentional and carries meaning. What meaning? Researchers have proposed several possibilities. Deliberate mutilation as a form of mourning or sacrifice, which is documented in some cultural traditions. The use of specific hand configurations as a form of language, with different finger combinations encoding different messages. Or simply individual variation in a tradition that allowed multiple valid expressions. The traditional owners of sites with unusual hand stencils sometimes know what the specific configurations mean. Sometimes that knowledge has not been fully transmitted. Sometimes the knowledge is held, but not for public sharing. What is certain is that someone thought about their hand before pressing it to the rock. Someone made a decision about what the stencil would show. The image is deliberate. It is a message, or a record, or a statement. It has been pressed against the rock for tens of thousands of years, waiting for us to read it. Number 15. The figures that are layered, time written over time. Here is something remarkable about the rock walls of northern Australia. They are not single documents. They are palimpsests. A palimpsest is a manuscript in which writing has been scraped away and written over, so that the surface carries the traces of multiple texts, layers of meaning written at different times. The rock walls of Arnhem Land and the Kimberley are palimpsests, image after image painted over earlier image, the newer obscuring the older, all of it compressed into the few centimeters of depth that the rock surface provides. At some sites, researchers working carefully with raking light and digital enhancement have been able to partially separate the layers, to read the sequence, to understand what came first and what came after. The sequence is itself information. When one type of figure consistently appears beneath another type of figure, it tells you something about relative chronology. When 2 types of figure appear to have been painted at the same time, placed in deliberate relationship to each other, it tells you they were part of the same artistic and cosmological system. But the layers also create images that are genuinely confusing. At some sites, the overlap of multiple generations of painting has produced compound figures, composites in which parts of different images have merged in the viewer's eye to create something that looks like a single being, but is actually 2 or 3 separate paintings made at different times. These accidental composites sometimes look very strange, and they have sometimes been treated as intentional depictions of unusual beings. This is a genuine methodological challenge for researchers. The first step in analyzing any rock art figure is to correctly identify its boundaries, to determine where one figure ends and another begins. In heavily layered sites, this can be genuinely difficult, and getting it wrong leads to misidentification of accidental composites as intentional, unusual figures. Experienced researchers are aware of this and work carefully to avoid it. But the research literature does contain examples of figures that were described as unusual, that later, more careful analysis revealed to be composites of separately painted, ordinary images. This is important to acknowledge honestly. Some of the unusual figures in Northern Australian rock art may be misleading, not because the researchers who described them were dishonest, but because the layered nature of the images created optical illusions. But some of them are not composites. Some of the most carefully analyzed unusual figures in the Kimberley and Arnhem Land traditions have been confirmed by careful layered analysis using modern imaging technology to be single intentional images. They are not accidents of overlap. They are exactly what they appear to be, deliberate depictions of unusual beings, painted by artists who knew what they were painting and painted it with care. And some of the layered sites have produced something else, an indication of continuity. The same unusual being type appears in the earliest layers of a site and in the most recent layers. The same characteristic form, the same unusual features, painted at the bottom of the stratigraphic sequence and again at the top. The being was known in the time of the earliest paintings. The being was still known in the time of the most recent paintings. Over what period? At some sites, the stratigraphic range from bottom to top represents more than 30,000 years of painting. 30,000 years of painting the same unusual being. What does that mean? It means, at minimum, that the tradition of depicting that being is more persistent and more deeply rooted in the cultural life of this landscape than almost any other cultural tradition in human history. It means that the beings depicted were considered significant enough to be worth painting continuously across a span of time that encompasses the entire known history of every other civilization on the planet. It may mean something more than that. Number 16. The object holders. Figures carrying things we cannot name. At sites across the Kimberley and Arnhem Land, there are figures who carry things. This is not unusual. Rock art figures around the world carry things. They carry spears, they carry digging sticks, they carry bags and baskets and ceremonial objects and children. The depiction of figures with objects is one of the most common features of global rock art traditions, and is generally interpretable as a record of the things that mattered in the daily and ceremonial life of the people doing the painting. But some of the objects being carried in Northern Australian rock art do not match any identified category of object from the archaeological or ethnographic record. There are figures who carry what appears to be a bag or container of unusual shape, not the elongated carrying bags documented in Aboriginal material culture, but something rounder, something that appears to be sealed, something with features that suggest not a woven basket or a skin bag, but a more structured container. There are figures who carry what has been described as a staff or a rod, but with features at its extremity that are not consistent with either the fighting stick or the ceremonial staff types that appear elsewhere in the art. The end of the staff is complex. It has additional structure, not simply a straight termination. There are figures who hold something in front of their faces, at approximately face level, in a position that might be consistent with looking through something or with holding something to the face for a specific purpose. These objects are painted with the same care as the figures that hold them. They are not vague or casual. They are represented with attention to specific details of form that indicates the artist knew what they were showing and considered the details important. Researchers have proposed that the unidentifiable objects are ceremonial objects whose specific forms have not survived and are not documented because the ceremonies they belong to changed or ended before the ethnographic record began. This is a strong possibility. Ceremonies change. Objects associated with specific ceremonial contexts can disappear entirely when those ceremonies shift. Stylized representations of recognizable objects, in which the stylization has moved far enough from naturalism that the original referent is no longer obvious to outsiders, but would have been perfectly clear to the tradition's participants. Art traditions develop conventions, and those conventions can make perfectly ordinary objects look exotic to anyone outside the tradition. Representations of objects known to the tradition, but from such a distant time that the objects themselves no longer exist. Some objects in the rock art may represent things that were significant and real in the culture 10,000 or 20,000 years ago, and that had disappeared from use long before European contact, which itself had been long enough ago that the most recent generations of traditional owners had no memory of the object's identity. And then there's the category of object that the traditional owners themselves sometimes describe as belonging to beings rather than to humans. Objects carried by sky beings, or by ancestor beings who predate the current human community, that are the implements of a kind of agency or power that humans do not have, and whose visual form expresses that difference. At a specific site in the Wellington Range of Arnhem Land, a series of figures carrying unusual objects has been discussed in the research literature as among the most puzzling examples of object-carrying figures in Australian rock art. The objects appear to be flat and roughly oval, held at arm's length in a way that suggests they are being displayed rather than used, shown rather than employed. They have markings that appear to be on their surface rather than on the reverse, markings that appear intentional rather than accidental, markings that carry the quality of information. What kind of information? On what surface? The research literature notes the puzzling quality of these objects and then, appropriately, declines to propose a definitive identification. The honest position is that these objects are not identified. The honest question is whether they represent things that have a name in the traditions whose images they appear in, and the honest answer is that this has not been fully documented, because the relevant knowledge has not been made available for documentation, if it is held at all. The objects are on the walls, the figures hold them carefully, and what they are is not known. Number 17. The flying figures, images of movement against gravity. Human beings do not fly. This is one of the facts of our physical existence that is so fundamental that most traditions do not need to articulate it. We know we cannot fly. We look up at birds and imagine what it would feel like. We dream of it, but we do not do it. And yet, in the rock art of Northern Australia, there are figures that are painted in positions that can only be described as airborne. Not falling, not jumping, flying. The distinction matters. A figure caught at the top of a jump is a figure in a specific posture, with weight still registering in the bent knees and the angled body, with the implication of an immediately preceding push-off and an immediately following landing. The physics of the pose is still terrestrial. A flying figure is different. The body is extended. The posture suggests sustained movement against gravity, rather than a momentary release of accumulated spring force. The relationship of the figure to the background, to the ground plane, to other figures, suggests not a moment in a jumping sequence, but a different kind of locomotion entirely. Flying figures appear in Arnhem Land. They appear in the Kimberley. They appear in the Cape York rock art tradition, and they are consistent in their visual quality across these geographically separated traditions. They are not jumping. They are moving through the air in a way that normal human bodies do not. Researchers have approached this in two main ways. The first approach is to note that the representation of flight in rock art is a convention, not a literal depiction. Many cultures have developed artistic conventions for representing movement that do not require the depicted position to be physically possible. A figure can be shown in a position that the artist and the tradition's audience understand to represent flight without anyone asserting that the figure actually flew, in the way that a superhero in a comic book is shown flying without any reader concluding that the comic is a documentary. This is a reasonable point. Artistic conventions for representing spiritual realities are not literally descriptive. The Mini in flight in Arnhem Land rock art may be representing the Mini's quality of lightness, of freedom from the gravitational constraints that bind heavier beings, rather than asserting that at a specific moment, a specific Mini was observed in a specific airborne posture. The second approach is to take the depiction more seriously as a record, not necessarily of literal physical flight, but of an experienced reality. Several researchers studying rock art in the context of altered states of consciousness, drawing on the work of scholars like David Lewis Williams on the neuropsychology of rock art production, have proposed that flying figures in rock art may record visionary experiences in which the sensation of flight was genuinely felt by the painter. The sensation of flight is well documented as a feature of certain visionary states, including those induced by specific plant substances, by extreme conditions of fasting or sleep deprivation, by sensory isolation, and by certain forms of intense meditation. If the artists who painted flying figures were painting what they had experienced, rather than what they had observed in ordinary waking reality, the flying figures are a record of genuine human experience, not a fictional convention. And then there is a third approach, which is simply to ask what the Beninj/Mungai and other traditional owners say about flying beings. The answer is that they say some beings fly. Not all beings, not humans ordinarily, but some beings. The Namaroto fly, the Mimi in some accounts can fly, various creator beings can fly. The capacity for flight is associated with specific categories of being who are not ordinary humans. And the depiction of those beings in flight is a depiction of their nature, not a metaphor for something else. The figures fly because the beings fly. That is what the tradition says. And the figures have been on the rock, airborne, for tens of thousands of years. Number 18. The ceremonial figures and what they tell us about society. Not all of the unusual figures in Northern Australian rock art are unusual because they show beings we cannot identify. Some are unusual because of what they tell us about the social and ceremonial life of the people who painted them, and what that life reveals about the antiquity and complexity of human society in this part of the world. At sites across Arnhem Land, there are figures shown in what are clearly ceremonial contexts, groups of figures arranged in formations that suggest structured ritual activity. Individual figures shown in postures associated with specific ceremonies, postures that traditional owners can sometimes identify as belonging to specific ceremonial traditions that are still practiced today. This is remarkable. When a Beninj/Mungai elder looks at a painting that has been on a rock wall for 10,000 years and recognizes the posture as belonging to a ceremony that they know, that they have participated in, that their grandparents participated in, the continuity that recognition demonstrates is extraordinary. 10,000 years of continuous ceremonial tradition, the same body postures, the same movements, the same ritual positions, maintained from the time of the oldest paintings to the present day. This is not mere cultural persistence of the kind that all long-established cultures demonstrate. This is a specific and detailed continuity of a very specific kind of knowledge. The positions of ceremony, the choreography of the sacred, maintained through a living tradition for 10,000 years. But some of the ceremonial figures also show things that are unusual even within the long ceremonial tradition. There are ceremony scenes in which not all the participants appear to be human. There are figures whose presence in the ceremonial context marks them as participants, as active agents in the ceremony, rather than as observers or as beings being addressed by the ceremony, but whose form is not the form of an ordinary human. These non-human participants in ceremony are, in the tradition's terms, straightforwardly explicable. Ceremonies in Aboriginal Australian tradition are not performed only for human audiences and not performed only by human participants. Creator beings are present at ceremonies. Ancestor beings participate. The spiritual world is not separate from the ceremonial world, but continuous with it. And beings of the spiritual world are present in ceremony in ways that are as real as the presence of the human participants. The painting of non-human beings in ceremonial scenes is thus not strange from within the tradition. It is a comprehensive representation of the ceremony as it actually is, which includes its non-human participants. From outside the tradition, these figures raise questions. What do they look like? How do they differ from the human participants? What do they carry or wear that marks them as non-human? And what does the way they are shown tell us about how the tradition understands the relationship between human and non-human participants in ceremony? The answers are complex and only partially available to outside researchers, but one consistent thread in what is available is this. The non-human participants in ceremonial paintings are often the same beings that appear in non-ceremonial contexts elsewhere in the rock art tradition. The Wanjina who appears in ceremony is the same being whose image appears in isolation. The ancestor figures who participate in ceremony are the same ancestor figures who appear in the story-based paintings of the landscape. The ceremony is not a performance for an absent audience. It is a gathering, and the rock art records who gathered. Number 19. The Deepest Archives. Figures Too Old to Name. As we approach the end of our journey through the rock art of Northern Australia, we come to the figures that are the hardest to engage with, the oldest. George Chalupka developed the most detailed sequence of Arnhem Land rock art styles over decades of fieldwork, and at the base of his sequence, he placed a category he called the archaic, or large naturalistic figures. These are among the earliest images in the Arnhem Land sequence, predating the Mimi tradition, predating the X-ray tradition, predating the Wanjina tradition. They are, by some estimates, among the oldest art in the world. The large naturalistic figures are drawn with a confident naturalism that is itself remarkable. Not the schematic simplicity that characterizes much very ancient art, but a genuine attempt to represent the forms of beings in something approaching their actual visual quality. The animals in this tradition are recognizable. Specific species are identifiable. Phyllocines, echidnas, macropods, specific fish species. The artists observed the natural world and rendered it with precision. And among the animals, there are figures that are not animals. Large humanoid forms, sometimes with animal features, sometimes with features that are simply unusual, painted with the same confident naturalism as the recognizable animals around them. These are the figures that raise the deepest questions. If the artist painted a thylacine, they painted a thylacine because they had seen a thylacine. The naturalism of the animal depictions in the large naturalistic tradition is evidence of direct observation. The artists painted what they saw. If the same artists, using the same naturalistic style, painted a humanoid figure with unusual features, the logic of the tradition suggests they painted what they saw. What did they see? 40 or 50,000 years ago, in the landscape of what is now Arnhem Land, the human occupants of Australia had been there for perhaps 5,000 to 20,000 years, depending on which dating estimates are correct. They had never seen a European. They had never seen many of the species that are now found in the region. They were living in a world that was, in its ecological details, different from any world that has existed since the end of the last ice age. And they were painting. They were painting animals with such precision that modern zoologists can identify the species. And they were painting beings that we cannot identify. The beings they painted in the deepest layers of the Arnhem Land sequence are not simple or schematic. They are complex. They are observed. They are painted by people who were paying close attention to what they were seeing and rendering it as accurately as they could. The question of what they were seeing is a question that no currently available methodology can definitively answer. We can say what the images look like. We can note the unusual features. We can record what the traditions that have continuity with those ancient painters say about the beings depicted. We cannot, with honesty, say we know what was there. This is the limit, and it is important to respect it, not as a failure, but as an honest acknowledgement of the boundaries of what we can know from this distance in time. The figures are on the rock. They have been there since before the agricultural revolution, since before the development of writing, since before the construction of any monument that any other civilization has left standing. They are the oldest art that human hands are likely to have made anywhere in the world. And some of them show beings that nobody, in all the time since they were painted, has satisfactorily identified. That is not a mystery that will be resolved by a clever hypothesis. It is a mystery that may require a completely different kind of attention. Number 20. The question that has always been here. We have traveled tonight through 20 categories of figure in the rock art of Northern Australia. We have looked at the Guon Guon and their impossible elegance. We have sat with the Wanjina and their mouthless authority. We have followed the Lightning Brothers into the heart of Wardaman cosmology. We have looked into the opened bodies of the X-ray figures. We have stood in Quinkin country and felt the attention of beings watching from the rock. We have considered the tall beings of Arnhem Land, the fragile Mimi, the desert figures, the threatened million of Murujuga. We have thought about the cross-cultural resonances that demand explanation and do not receive one that fully satisfies. We have looked at helmeted beings and antenna-bearing beings, and skeletal night flyers, and object holders, and airborne figures. We have sat with the ceremonial complexity and with the deepest, oldest layers of the archive. And now we arrive at the question that has been underneath all of this. Not the question of who painted these images. We largely know who painted them. The ancestors of the Aboriginal Australians who live beside these images today painted them, over periods of time stretching back further than any other artistic tradition in the world. Not the question of how they painted them. The techniques are understood well enough. The pigments, the binding agents, the application methods, the selection of surfaces. The question is, what did they see? When the painter of the Guon Guon stood before the sandstone cliff face 17,000 or 30,000 years ago and began to lay down the pigment that would produce those elegant, decorated, enigmatic figures, they were painting something. Not from imagination only, not from convention only, from something they knew, something they had experienced or been taught or been told by someone who had experienced it. What was it? The traditional owners of these images have answers. Some of those answers can be shared with outside researchers, and some cannot. The ones that can be shared point consistently in a direction that Western academic frameworks are not well equipped to follow. They describe real beings, not metaphors for human psychological states, not artistic conventions for expressing abstract ideas. Beings. Specific beings, with specific characteristics, specific behaviors, specific histories, specific relationships to the landscape and to the human communities that have shared that landscape with them. The Wanjina are real. The Mimi are real. The Lightning Brothers are real. The Namaroto are real. The Quinkins are real. They are real in a framework of reality that does not map cleanly onto the framework of physical materialism that Western science operates within, but that is not the same as saying they are not real. Different frameworks of reality produce different questions and different answers and access different aspects of what is actually there. Here's what the rock art of Northern Australia demonstrates as a plain matter of documented fact. For somewhere between 40,000 and 60,000 years, human beings in the most ancient, continuous cultural tradition in the world have been painting the same category of beings on the walls of the same landscape. The Wanjina have been painted for longer than agriculture has existed. The Mimi tradition is older than every civilization in the historical record. The large naturalistic figures predate every monument that any other human culture has ever built. The people who painted these figures were not confused. They were not primitive. They were among the most intelligent, most perceptive, most ecologically sophisticated humans who have ever lived. They had developed a tradition of careful observation of the natural world that was so precise it could identify specific animal species in paint on rock. They had developed a tradition of ceremonial knowledge so deep and so carefully maintained that specific ritual postures painted 10,000 years ago are still recognizable to the descendants of those painters today. When people of that quality of attention and that depth of tradition painted beings they called Wanjina and Mimi and Namaroto and the others we have visited tonight, they were painting something that mattered, something real in their framework of reality, something that had been encountered, experienced, known. We do not have to share their framework to respect what they painted. We do not have to have an answer to the question of what these beings are to acknowledge that the question is genuine. The rock art of Northern Australia holds a mystery that is not a mystery of primitive misunderstanding or artistic convention or simple cultural imagination. It is a mystery of genuine encounter, genuine knowledge, genuine relationship between humans and beings that Western categories of the real have not yet found a home for. The figures are on the rock. They have been there since the beginning of human memory, and they are still waiting to be seen.
What the rock remembers. The morning light on the Kimberley sandstone. You have heard it described now in 20 different contexts, 20 different sites, 20 different categories of image. But to actually stand there in the first light, when the cliff face catches the horizontal rays and the painted figures seem to lean forward out of the rock, is an experience that description cannot fully prepare you for. It is not just that the images are beautiful, though many of them are. It is not just that they are old, though their antiquity is enough to reorder your sense of time. It is that they are present. They are here. In whatever sense matters, the beings on those walls are not historical relics. They are not museum pieces. They are not simply evidence of a past that is over. They are ongoing. The Wanjina are still painted and repainted by the people who have always cared for them. The Mimi are still described by Benin/Mungai people who live in relationship with them. The Lightning Brothers are still there in the storm that rolls across the Victoria River country every wet season. The Quinkins are still in the crevices of the sandstone. The rock art of Northern Australia is not the record of a world that ended. It is the record of a world that continues, a world that runs alongside and beneath and through the world that most of us have been taught is the only one. A world that is tens of thousands of years older than any other human tradition anywhere on Earth, and that has never, in all that time, stopped. If you sleep well tonight with the images on those walls in your mind, that is enough. If you find yourself curious tomorrow, that is even better. If you find a way to encounter this tradition with the respect it deserves, with the humility that 40,000 years of human wisdom demands of us, then something real will have passed between those ancient painters and you across the gulf of time.
They painted for reasons. One of those reasons was to be seen. Sleep now. Let the figures be with you in the dark. Let the Mimi be thin in their crevices, and the Wanjina look at you with their great eyes, and the Namaroto fly above, and the lightning brothers argue their old argument in the distant sky. They are old enough to be patient. They have been waiting for this kind of attention for a very long time. Good night. Deeper examination. Returning to the figures. Deeper. The Guon Guon and the ornament problem. Let us go back to the decorations. The Guon Guon figures are not simply unusual because they exist. They are unusual because of the specificity of what they show. And the most specific and most debated element of what they show is what is happening on their bodies and heads. Researcher Graham Walsh, who spent decades documenting Kimberley rock art and who produced the most comprehensive catalog of the Guon Guon tradition prior to his death, described the decorations in detail. What he found, across hundreds of figures at dozens of sites, was consistency. The same types of ornament appearing repeatedly, across a wide geographic area, rendered with enough variation to indicate that different artists were working within a shared convention rather than copying each other, but with enough consistency to indicate that the convention was based on a shared understanding of what the beings looked like. This consistency is significant. When rock art figures across a wide geographic area show the same type of unusual feature, there are basically two explanations. Either the feature is a real characteristic of the beings depicted, observed by multiple independent painters who all painted what they saw, or the feature is a convention of the artistic tradition, developed and maintained as a way of marking these beings as belonging to a specific category. Both explanations are interesting. Neither eliminates the puzzle. If the feature is a convention, it raises the question of what the convention is encoding. Artistic conventions are not arbitrary. They develop as efficient ways of communicating specific information that matters to the tradition. The elongated limbs of Mimi figures are a convention, but a convention that encodes something real about the Mimi's nature, their fragility, their lightness, their difference from ordinary physical beings. What does the headdress convention encode about the Guon Guon's nature? If the feature is an observation, it raises the question of what was observed. What were these beings wearing on their heads that the painters of the Guon Guon tradition rendered with such consistent detail over such a wide area? The headdresses have several components that appear consistently. There is often a central vertical element that rises from the crown of the head. There are lateral elements that extend outward from the central element in organized arrangements. Sometimes there are what appear to be pendant elements hanging down from the lateral extensions. The overall form is structured and complex in a way that immediately suggests something made, something constructed, rather than something natural. None of this construction has been found in the archaeological record of the Kimberley. No physical object matching the headdress convention in the Guon Guon paintings has ever been excavated from any site in the region. This could mean that the objects were made from organic materials that have not survived, which is extremely plausible in the wet season conditions of the Kimberley. It could mean that the headdresses were not physical objects at all, but spiritual attributes of the beings depicted, represented in visual form. It could mean that the beings who wore them are not the same beings who left archaeological traces in the region, because they were not physical in the way that produces archaeological traces. The Nagadanyan and other Kimberley peoples who have knowledge of the Guon Guon tradition have described these beings as not human, as beings who preceded humans in this landscape, as beings who had their own ways and their own characteristics that were different from human ways and characteristics. The headdresses in this telling are not things that humans made and wore. They are attributes of beings whose nature is different from human nature. This does not resolve the archaeological question, but it reframes it. The question is not what human artifact matches these headdresses. The question is, what kind of being is being depicted, and how does the visual form of the headdress encode its nature? That question opens up rather than closing down, and the opening it creates is one that the most careful, most experienced, most respectful researchers are still standing inside. The Wanjina and the rain. The relationship between the Wanjina and rain is not metaphorical. In the Kimberley, rain is survival. The region has one of the most extreme seasonal climates in Australia, with a wet season that brings flooding rain from November to April, and a dry season that is genuinely dry, in which many water sources fail, and the landscape takes on a quality of patience that can be read as waiting. The transition between these two seasons, the build-up, when the air becomes heavy and the thunderheads begin to build along the ranges, is one of the most dramatic atmospheric experiences in Australia. The Wanjina brought the wet season. They continue to bring it. The relationship between the Wanjina images in the rock shelters and the arrival of rain is not a symbolic or metaphorical relationship in the understanding of the people who maintain it. The Wanjina are rain. When the images are in good condition, properly maintained and repainted as needed, the rain comes properly. When the images are neglected or damaged, the relationship is disturbed and the rain may not come or may come wrong, too much or too little. This is a system of ecological management through spiritual relationship. It sounds completely unlike anything in the Western scientific tradition of environmental management, and yet it has worked. The Kimberley is still inhabited by the peoples who have always lived there, whose relationship with the Wanjina has maintained the environmental cycle that makes life there possible, for a period of time that vastly exceeds the period in which any other environmental management system has operated anywhere. Researchers studying the intersection of indigenous ecological knowledge and environmental science have noted that the Wanjina tradition encodes specific knowledge about the seasonal climate system of the Kimberley in a form that is both spiritually effective, in the sense of organizing human behavior in relationship to the environment in adaptive ways, and ecologically accurate, in the sense that the understanding of the timing, distribution, and significance of rainfall encoded in the Wanjina tradition corresponds well with what meteorological science has subsequently documented. The absence of a mouth on the Wanjina is also ecologically relevant in this framework. The Wanjina's power is a power of induction, not of speech. The rain does not arrive because the Wanjina says it should arrive. The rain arrives because the Wanjina is rain. And when the relationship between the human community and the Wanjina is properly maintained, the rain comes when it is needed. The maintenance of that relationship is the job of the custodians of the Wanjina sites. It requires knowledge that is transmitted through the appropriate ceremonial channels. It requires the repainting of the images at appropriate times. It requires the maintenance of the behavioral protocols associated with the sites. It requires the continuation of the ceremonies that refresh the relationship. It has required this for as long as the Wanjina tradition has existed, and the rain has come. The Mimi, and the question of teaching. There is a specificity to the claim that the Mimi taught humans to paint that is worth sitting with. Not taught humans art, taught humans to paint. A specific technology, a specific practice, on a specific kind of surface. The claim is not that the Mimi inspired humans toward aesthetic activity in a general sense. The claim is that the Mimi showed humans how to put pigment on rock. This is a very precise claim, and it carries implications. If the Mimi taught humans to paint on rock, then the rock art tradition in Arnhem Land did not develop through a process of independent invention by human beings, gradually discovering the possibilities of marking rock surfaces. It developed through teaching, through the transmission of knowledge from beings who already possessed it to humans who did not. The oldest rock art in Arnhem Land, in this telling, is not the earliest experimental work of humans feeling their way toward art. It is the work of beings who already knew how to paint, who were already accomplished artists, who were already communicating through visual images on rock. This is a radically different origin story for art than the one that Western art history tells. Western art history describes the earliest human art as a product of the emergence of modern human cognitive capacities, as the external evidence of the mental revolution that produced language, symbolic thought, and the capacity for abstract representation. Art, in this framework, is an invention, a human invention. The Beninj/Mungai framework says it is not an invention, it is a gift. A transmission from beings who existed before humans, who had their own ways of knowing and communicating, who chose to teach those ways to the humans who were arriving in this landscape. You do not have to choose between these frameworks. They are not in logical contradiction. It is possible that the cognitive capacities that make symbolic art possible did develop in the way that cognitive science describes, and that those capacities, once present, were engaged by the humans who came to Australia in relationship with beings who already had their own visual communication tradition. The two accounts can be read as describing the same events from different levels of analysis, but the Beninj/Mungai account carries information that the Western scientific account does not, which is information about what the beings who taught painting were like, about their nature, their characteristics, their ongoing relationship with the human community that learned from them. The mimi are thin because they are fragile. They are fragile because they are not made of the same physical substance as the beings that can withstand wind. They are artists of extraordinary skill and precision. They live inside the rock that they taught humans to paint. Is this metaphor? Is it literal? Is it both? Is it neither, but something else entirely that requires different categories to properly receive? The mimi are in the rock. The art they taught humans to make is also in the rock. The connection between the teachers and the subject matter and the medium is complete. The X-ray animals and what they reveal about scientific thinking. Here is something that the X-ray tradition reveals if you look at it from a particular angle. It reveals that the Aboriginal Australian artists who developed the X-ray style were, in the terminology of modern cognitive science, generating multi-level representations. They were holding in mind simultaneously the external appearance of an animal and its internal structure. And they were devising a visual convention that could represent both at the same time on a two-dimensional surface. This is not a simple cognitive task. Generating a unified representation that simultaneously encodes two distinct levels of description of the same object requires working memory, abstract reasoning, and the capacity to imagine an object from multiple perspectives simultaneously. These are the cognitive operations that psychologists call executive function, and they are among the highest level cognitive capacities that human brains have developed. The X-ray tradition is, in this sense, evidence of the full flowering of the cognitive capacities that distinguish modern humans. The people who developed it were not primitive. They were thinking in ways that are directly continuous with the ways in which the most sophisticated modern thinkers think. There is a specific way in which the X-ray tradition intersects with what we now call scientific thinking that is worth noting. The aspiration to understand the inside of things, to know what is inside a body, not just what is on its surface, is an aspiration that drives both the X-ray tradition and the development of anatomy as a scientific discipline. The difference is methodological. The anatomist dissects to look inside. The X-ray artist imagines the inside and paints it as if it were simultaneously visible. Both approaches are driven by the same intellectual impulse, the desire to know what is really there, not just what appears on the surface. The X-ray artists of Arnhem Land were engaged in an inquiry that is recognizably scientific in its orientation, even if the methods and frameworks were entirely different from those of Western science. They were asking, what is this thing really? What is its complete nature? And they were developing visual conventions to answer that question as completely as possible. The results are among the most intellectually interesting artworks in human history. Not just beautiful, though they are beautiful, intellectually interesting, because they are the product of a tradition of inquiry that has been running for thousands of years and has produced a distinctive and sophisticated body of knowledge about the interior lives of beings. Some of that knowledge has no parallel in the Western scientific tradition, and some of it may contain things that the Western scientific tradition has not yet discovered. Murujuga and the Extinction Record. One of the most scientifically significant things about the Murujuga rock art is what it tells us about Australian megafauna extinction. The thylacine, the Tasmanian tiger, is extinct on the Australian mainland. The last mainland population died out somewhere around 2,000 years ago, possibly due to the arrival of the dingo, a domestic dog brought to Australia by humans from Southeast Asia roughly that long ago. The thylacine survived in Tasmania, where the dingo never reached, until the 20th century, when the last known individual died in the Hobart Zoo in 1936. On Murujuga, there are images of thylacines. Not ambiguous images, precise, naturalistic images of thylacines, showing the characteristic striped haunches and dog-like body that are the definitive identification marks of the species. The images are specific enough that researchers are confident in their identification. The thylacine images on Murujuga are among the evidence that some of the site's rock art predates the extinction of the mainland thylacine population, placing their creation at 2,000 years ago at minimum. But given the range of dates being proposed for Murujuga imagery generally, some of the thylacine images may be much older. The thylacine images are thus a direct record of the presence of a now extinct species in the Pilbara region. They document, with the precision of naturalistic rock art, that this species lived in this landscape at the time the images were made. Similar records exist elsewhere in Australian rock art. Images of species that are now regionally or globally extinct, painted with enough naturalistic accuracy to allow confident identification, paint by paint preserving the record of a wildlife community that no longer exists. This makes the Rock Art Archive one of the most significant sources of paleontological and ecological data in the world. Not a source that replaces fossil evidence, but a source that complements it, providing not just the presence of species, but their appearance in life, their postures and behaviors, the details that bones do not preserve. The ecological record embedded in Australian rock art has been studied systematically by very few researchers, because the skills required to read the ecological content, a combination of rock art expertise and zoological expertise, are rarely found in the same person. It is an area where significant new knowledge is likely to be found when the right collaborative research is done. Some of the beings painted at Murujuga and elsewhere may also be extinct. Beings that are shown with naturalistic accuracy. Beings that the artists observed and painted with the same care they gave to the thylacine and the barramundi. Beings that have been described by researchers as anatomically unusual and that cannot be identified as any known species. If the thylacine images are a record of a real animal that is now extinct, what are the unidentifiable being images a record of? The object holders and the question of technology. Let us think carefully about what technology is. Technology is not simply tools. Technology is the application of systematic knowledge to achieve specific outcomes using material means. A fishing line is technology. A ceremony for ensuring fish abundance is also technology, in the sense that it is a systematic application of knowledge to achieve a specific outcome. The difference is in what the knowledge is about and what material means are employed. When Aboriginal Australian rock art depicts beings carrying objects, it is often depicting the tools of their technology. The hunter with the spear is depicted with the spear because the spear is how the hunter achieves the outcome of hunting. The tool is part of the depiction because the tool is part of the identity and function of the being. When the rock art depicts beings carrying objects we cannot identify, the same logic applies. The objects are part of the identity and function of those beings. What we cannot identify is the technology that belongs to beings whose identity and function we also cannot identify. This is circular, but it is an honest circularity. We cannot identify the beings, so we cannot identify their tools. We cannot identify the tools, which makes it harder to identify the beings. But there are things that the unidentified objects tell us even without identification. The care with which they are rendered tells us they are important. In rock art, the level of detail given to an element of a painting indicates its significance to the artist. Incidental objects are rendered summarily. Important objects are rendered carefully. The unidentified objects in these figures are rendered carefully. They matter. The consistency of certain object types across geographically separated sites tells us they represent something real and shared, not an idiosyncratic artistic invention. When the same unusual object appears at a site in the Kimberley and a site in Arnhem Land, painted by different artists in different traditions at different times, it is because the same real thing is being depicted, not because a specific convention spread from one site to the other. And the specificity of the objects, the particular shapes and features that make them distinctive, tells us they are not generic markers of status or power, but representations of specific things. Real specific things with real specific forms. What things? Here is an honest accounting of the possibilities. The objects might be specific types of ceremonial implement that were used in practices that have not survived and that are not documented. This is the most conservative and most defensible interpretation. Many aspects of Aboriginal Australian material culture have been lost or altered since European contact, and the objects depicted in rock art might represent practices that no longer exist in their original forms. The objects might be types of natural material, shells, bones, stones, organic substances, prepared and used in ways that are not obvious from their visual representation alone. A carefully prepared piece of bark, shaped and treated and used for a specific purpose, might look in a painted representation like something completely unidentifiable to someone who has never seen that type of preparation. The objects might be the implements of beings whose nature is different from human nature, designed for activities and purposes that have no human equivalent. If a being's primary function is spiritual rather than physical, its tools might be spiritual rather than physical, and the visual representation of spiritual tools might look like no physical tool that anyone has ever seen. The objects might be things that the human painters were shown or told about by beings they encountered, things they tried to render accurately from a viewing experience that was not an ordinary everyday encounter with known objects, but an encounter in a context, a vision, a ceremony, a meeting, in which the normal rules of perception were not operating in their ordinary way. Each of these possibilities is genuinely possible. None of them can be elevated to certainty with the evidence currently available. The objects are on the walls, the figures hold them carefully, and the question of what they are remains one of the genuinely open questions in the study of human symbolic activity. Deeper, what the pilots and travelers of ancient Australia knew. There is a navigation tradition in Australia that is among the most sophisticated wayfinding systems in human history. It is called the songline system, or the dreaming tracks, or different names in different languages. The system is not a map in any ordinary sense. It is a musical archive. The landscape of Australia is mapped in songs. Each song encodes information about a specific route across the landscape, the features of the terrain, the water holes and food sources, the sacred sites and the dangerous places, the seasonal variations in what is available and what is not. To know a song is to know a route. To be a keeper of many songs is to be a navigator of the continent. The precision of the information encoded in the songlines is well documented. Researchers who have followed specific songline routes have found that the songs correctly encode information about terrain features in the order in which they are encountered along the route. Information about the location and character of water holes in otherwise dry country has been confirmed as accurate at locations where no member of the research team had previously been. The system works over enormous distances. Individual songlines extend for hundreds, or in some cases, thousands of kilometers. The continent is crisscrossed by a network of songlines, representing the routes taken by ancestor beings in the dreaming as they traveled and created the landscape features they encountered. The songs that encode these routes are maintained by the communities along the route, each community holding their section and being responsible for its maintenance and transmission. This system has allowed people to navigate the most challenging terrain on Earth, the Australian desert, for at least 40,000 years. It has maintained the accuracy of route information without a single written character, without a single physical map, without any material record beyond the landscape features that the songs describe. The rock art connects to this system. Many of the most significant rock art sites in Australia are located at points along songlines. They are not randomly distributed across the landscape. They are at specific nodes in the network of sacred geography, at places where routes converge, or where specific events in the dreaming occurred, or where specific beings are present. The images on the walls of these nodes encode information that is relevant to their location in the network. A site on a specific songline might show the ancestor being whose route passes through it. It might show the event that occurred at that place in the dreaming. It might show the relationships between the beings who are associated with that node in the network. The unusual beings in the rock art at songline nodes are often the ancestor beings who traveled those routes, whose nature and characteristics are encoded in the paintings as a record of who passed through and what they carried and what they did. Understanding the rock art in the context of the songline network would require access to the songlines themselves, which are not information for public sharing. But it provides a framework for understanding why specific images appear at specific sites. They are there because the network placed them there, because the beings associated with that location are those beings. The unusual beings painted at unusual sites are unusual because they are specific. They are not generic spirit beings. They are the specific ancestor beings associated with specific nodes in the songline network. And the network extends across the continent and has been running continuously for tens of thousands of years. Supplemental, the oldest questions. There is something humbling about standing at the edge of what archaeology can tell us. The images on the rock walls of northern Australia represent the oldest surviving record of human symbolic thought anywhere on the planet. 40,000 years. In that span of time, every other civilization that has risen and fallen on this earth has come and gone. The Sumerians, the Egyptians, the Greeks, Rome, the great dynasties of China, every civilization that left a written record, every culture that built something in stone, every society that produced work that later generations called history. All of it fits inside a fraction of the time that the traditions producing this rock art have been running. And the beings at the center of those traditions, the beings who are painted on the walls and described in the oral archives and maintained in the ceremonial life of the communities that have always known them, are still not explained. Not to Western science, not in terms that the frameworks of academic inquiry can fully accommodate. That is not a failure of science. It is an honest measure of the distance between what we currently know and what there is to know. The figures on the rock are patient. They have been patient for 40,000 years. They can wait a little longer. Closing reflection: the permission to not know. There is a specific kind of intellectual courage required for the study of ancient rock art. It is the courage to say, "I do not know." Not as a provisional statement, held while searching for the answer that will fill the gap, but as a stable position, maintained even when the gap is uncomfortable, even when the not knowing goes on for decades, even when the figures on the rock continue to resist every attempt at explanation. The beings in the rock art of Northern Australia have been resisting explanations for as long as Western researchers have been trying to provide them. The thylacines have been explained, the macropods have been explained, the ceremonial figures have been partially explained, the X-ray tradition has been partially explained, the Wanjina and the Mimi and the Lightning Brothers have been explained within the framework of the traditions that hold them, which is the most appropriate framework available. But some of the figures remain outside every explanation that has been offered. They remain outside the explanations of Western academic archaeology. They remain outside the simplified versions of traditional owner knowledge that are publicly available. They may have explanations within the deeper levels of traditional owner knowledge that are not publicly available. And if so, those explanations are there and are held by the appropriate people, and are not a gap in the knowledge of those traditions. But from the outside, from the position of someone who is not a custodian of those traditions, the honest statement is, "I do not know what these beings are. I do not know who they are. I do not know what the artists who painted them were encoding. I do not know whether what they were encoding was a literal observation, a visionary experience, a cosmological understanding, or something else that my categories of literal and visionary and cosmological are not adequate to describe." And this not knowing is not a failure. It is an accurate description of the current state of human knowledge about some of the oldest and most complex symbolic material that our species has ever produced. The figures on the walls of Northern Australia have been there since before there were historians to study them, before there were anthropologists to categorize them, before there were archaeologists to date them. They will be there, in most cases, long after the current generation of researchers has finished its work. They are not going anywhere. And the question of what they show, honestly held, openly acknowledged, passed on to the next generation of researchers with the same honesty, is one of the most profound and most important questions that the study of human symbolic activity has ever produced. It is the question of what else we knew once, what else we saw, what else we encountered in the long night of human experience on this planet before the record begins. The rock art of Northern Australia is a window into that long night. It does not give us a clear view, but it is the clearest view we have. And what we see through it, if we look honestly, is extraordinary. The pigment itself, what science finds in the paint. There is a kind of analysis happening now in rock art research that would have been science fiction 20 years ago. Researchers are examining the pigments themselves at the molecular and atomic level to understand not just what they are made of, but how they were made, where the components came from, and in some cases, when they were last exposed to sunlight. The ochre in Australian rock art is not a single substance. It is a family of substances, iron oxides in various forms and with various trace element profiles, and each source area has a distinctive chemical signature. Like the Lake Superior copper, whose geographic origin can be traced through trace element analysis, the ochre in specific rock art images can sometimes be traced to specific geological sources. At some sites, this analysis reveals that the ochre used in specific images was transported from source areas hundreds of kilometers away. This is not just a logistical observation. It is a statement about the social and ceremonial geography of the people who made those images. Ochre from specific sources was considered the appropriate pigment for specific images or specific ceremonies. The effort involved in acquiring it from a distant source was considered worthwhile. The choice of pigment was a meaningful choice. Some source areas in Australia have been identified as ochre procurement sites, places where people have been extracting ochre for purposes of painting, body decoration, and ceremony for tens of thousands of years. The Wilgemia ochre mine in Western Australia is one of the most documented, with evidence of ochre extraction spanning more than 30,000 years. It is one of the oldest known mining operations on the planet. The people who painted the images we have been discussing tonight were not using whatever materials happened to be close at hand. They were using carefully selected, sometimes long-traveled materials chosen for their specific properties and their specific significance. The red of the Guon Guon is not just red. It is a specific red, made from a specific ochre, from a specific source, chosen because that is the appropriate substance for painting those beings on that rock. The images are made with intention at every level. The being depicted, the location chosen, the pigment selected, the technique employed, the time of year of the painting, everything. We can recover some of that intentionality through scientific analysis. We can identify the pigment and sometimes its source. We can date approximately when the image was made. We can document its relationship to other images on the same surface. We cannot recover all of it. We cannot recover the knowledge in the mind of the painter about why this being, why this rock, why this red. That knowledge is either still held in the tradition or it is gone. But the image is there, painted with intention by someone who knew exactly what they were doing and why. And the image is speaking. The question is whether we are listening in the right way. Sound, fire, and night, the context of the original viewing. Here is something worth imagining. The rock art of Northern Australia was not made to be seen in daylight, by tourists walking a designated path, or in photographs on a screen. It was made to be seen by firelight. Firelight is directional, variable, warm, and alive. It flickers. It produces moving shadows. It changes the apparent depth of rock surfaces by shifting the angle at which light falls on them. Features that are invisible in flat, even light become visible in raking firelight. Shallow reliefs in the rock surface that painted figures were sometimes designed to incorporate suddenly appear. The paintings do what they were designed to do. They move. Imagine standing in a rock shelter in Arnhem Land at night. The fire is behind you. The walls of the shelter are painted. The firelight is moving over those painted surfaces, and in the moving light, the beings on the walls are moving. The Mimi are dancing. The Wanjina's eyes are tracking you. The X-ray fish are swimming. This is not an illusion in the pejorative sense of something that deceives. It is a designed experience, a deliberate use of specific properties of the medium and the context to produce a specific experiential result. The paintings were made for this experience. They were made to be alive in firelight. They were made to be seen in the context of ceremony and story and song, in the company of people who knew what they were looking at and why. We see them in daylight or in photographs. We see them stripped of their original context. We see them in the literal sense of registering their forms and colors, but we are not seeing them in the way they were made to be seen. This does not mean our daylight encounter with them is worthless. The figures are still extraordinary. The questions they raise are still genuine. But it means that any account of what they are doing, what effect they were designed to produce, what experience they were designed to create, has to acknowledge the context gap. The original viewers of these images were in the dark, with fire behind them, in community, in ceremony, in a state of attentiveness that had been cultivated through a lifetime of training in the specific tradition that produced the images. We are not in that position. We can approach it, a little, by being attentive, by being patient, by trying to see through the photographs to the surfaces behind them, and through the surfaces to the intentions behind them. But we are missing the fire. And the fire in this context is not incidental. It is part of the meaning. Supplemental. The children who learn from the walls. One more thing to hold as we come to the end of this journey. The rock art was not only for adults. It was not only for initiated men and women at the height of their ceremonial knowledge. It was for everyone. The rock shelters where many of the images are found were also living spaces. People cooked in them and slept in them and took shelter from rain in them. Children grew up in them, under the gaze of the Wanjina and in the presence of the Mimi, learning from their earliest years that the beings on the walls were real, that the images were a record of a world that extended beyond the everyday, that the rock itself was a kind of door to that larger world. The earliest memories of children who grew up in these shelters would have included the paintings. The images would have been part of the furnishing of reality for those children, as basic and as present as the trees outside, and the birds and the smell of the wet season approaching. Not decoration, not art in the gallery sense. Environment. In the context of that environmental embeddedness, the unusual beings on the walls would have been as real to those children as anything else in their world. The Mimi in the crevice would have been as present as the water monitor on the rocks outside. The Wanjina watching from the shelter wall would have been as real as the parent sleeping nearby. This is how a tradition maintains itself across tens of thousands of years, not through elaborate institutions or complex organizational structures, through the simple, persistent reality of growing up surrounded by its images, hearing its stories, participating in its ceremonies, learning from childhood that the world is a certain way, and that the beings on the walls are part of that world. Every child who grew up in a shelter painted with these images carried them into adulthood with the same certainty and the same ease that we carry our own most basic assumptions about reality. Not as learned beliefs, but as experienced facts. Not as cultural claims, but as direct knowledge. The tradition persisted because the world it described was the world those children lived in, not metaphorically, actually. The beings are real. They are on the walls of shelters in northern Australia. They have been real, for the people who have always lived there, for 40,000 years. And the images are still there, as old as any art anywhere in the world, as present as the rock that holds them, as patient as anything that has outlasted the rise and fall of every other human civilization, and is still here, still watching, still waiting for us to finally understand what we are being shown. Good night. Sleep well. The figures are on the walls. Place around the 45 to 60 minute mark in your final edit. Before we continue, if you are listening to this from somewhere in Australia, I would love to know where. Drop it in the comments. If you have ever visited any of these sites, if you have ever stood in front of a Wanjina or walked through Quinkin country or seen the rock art of the Kimberley in person, tell me about it. What did it feel like? What did you notice? I read every comment, and the accounts people share from their own encounters with these places are always the most interesting thing in the thread. Wherever you are in the world tonight, if you are finding this as interesting as I am, let me know. The story of the rock art of Northern Australia is one of those subjects that rewards attention indefinitely. The more you look, the more you see. And the more you see, the more the questions multiply rather than resolve. That is not a frustrating quality. That is the quality of a subject that is genuinely deep.